Let's start the story. Every empire has a hidden architect. Every king has a silent queen. But when the queen decides to speak, kingdoms tremble. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Riverside Country Club as Nikki Megan Cornwell adjusted her simple black dress and watched her husband command the room. Joe Cornwell stood at the center of the grand ballroom, his custom-tailored suit gleaming under the lights, surrounded by the city's most powerful construction moguls and real estate developers. His laugh boomed across the space as he gestured grandly, describing his latest project. The Cornwall Heights development will be the crown jewel of this city, Joe declared, his voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute confidence. 20 luxury towers, each one reaching toward the sky like fingers grasping at greatness itself. Nikki sipped her champagne and smiled politely as the crowd murmured their approval. She knew every detail of that project, had reviewed the architectural plans while Joe slept, had studied the environmental impact reports he'd never bothered to read, had quietly suggested the design modifications that would save millions in construction costs. But tonight, like every other night for years, she was simply Joe's wife. The vision, the execution, the sheer audacity of it all, continued Henderson Clark, the city's planning commissioner, clapping Joe on the shoulder. You've truly built something magnificent, Joe, from that first small residential complex to this empire. Remarkable. Joe's chest swelled with pride. It all started with a leap of faith, Henderson. Sometimes you have to risk everything to achieve greatness. Of course, having the right backing from the beginning makes all the difference. Nikki's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her champagne flute. The right backing. If only they knew the truth about that mysterious angel investor who had appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right amount of capital to launch Cornwall construction. If only they knew that Angel had been sitting quietly in the corner all these years, wearing designer knockoffs and being introduced as my wife. She keeps busy with charity work. Speaking of backing, interjected Miranda Walsh, a striking redhead in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. I've been analyzing your portfolio. Joe, the expansion potential is extraordinary. Miranda stepped closer to Joe, her hand resting briefly on his arm. We should discuss the international opportunities over dinner this week. Miranda's been invaluable, Joe announced to the group, his smile widening as he looked at the younger woman. She has an MBA from Wharton, speaks 4 languages, and has connections across 3 continents. The brains behind our expansion strategy. Nikki felt the familiar sting, the same one she'd felt countless times when Joe diminished her contributions while elevating others. She watched as Miranda basked in the praise, as the men in the circle nodded approvingly, as her husband's eyes lingered just a moment too long on Miranda's smile. How wonderful for you both, Nikki said softly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to sound genuine. It must be exciting to work with someone so accomplished. Joe turned toward his wife, as if suddenly remembering she existed. Oh, darling, come meet everyone properly. He placed his hand on her lower back with casual possessiveness. This is my wife, Nikki. She keeps herself busy with various activities. Charity work, mostly, Nikki added with practiced humility. Nothing as impressive as international business development, of course. How nice, Miranda said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's so important to have hobbies. The word hobbies hung in the air like a slap. Nikki's charity work included running literacy programs that had taught thousands of adults to read, organizing housing initiatives for veterans, and coordinating medical missions that had saved lives across 2 continents. But tonight, like every night, it was reduced to hobbies. Ladies and gentlemen, called out David Morrison, the evening's host, from the small stage at the front of the room. If I could have your attention, we're about to begin the silent auction for the Children's Hospital Foundation. As the crowd moved toward the auction tables, Joe was immediately swept away by admirers wanting to discuss business deals and golf handicaps. Nikki found herself standing alone near the bar, observing the scene with the detached clarity that came from years of being simultaneously present and invisible. "Another scotch, Mrs. Cornwell?" asked James, the bartender who had been working these events for decades. "Please." "And James, make it a double." James poured the drink with professional discretion, celebrating another successful evening for Mr. Cornwell's business. "Something like that." Nikki took a sip and felt the warmth spread through her chest. "Tell me, James, in all your years working these events, what's the most surprising thing you've learned about the people who attend them?" The older man considered the question carefully. That the most powerful person in the room is rarely the one everyone's looking at. Nikki studied his face. "Interesting observation. Take tonight, for instance," James continued, polishing glasses with methodical precision. "Everyone's focused on the man giving speeches and closing deals. But I've watched these circles for 30 years, Mrs. Cornwell. The real power? It's usually sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone who's really in charge." Before Nikki could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down at the screen and felt her pulse quicken. The angel investor would like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Cornwell. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Thornfield Industries executive floor. Come alone. Harrison Thornfield. Nikki stared at the message for a long moment, then looked across the room where Joe was holding court, his arm casually draped around Miranda's shoulders as they examined the auction items. The sight that once would have broken her heart now simply crystallized her resolve. She finished her scotch and approached the group. "Joe, darling, might I have a word?" Joe looked annoyed at the interruption. "Can it wait, sweetheart? We're discussing the Henderson project timeline." "Of course it can wait," Nikki replied smoothly. "I just wanted to let you know that you've received an interesting business opportunity. Someone wants to meet with you tomorrow." "Who?" Joe's attention was immediately focused. "The angel investor, your original backer, the one who made everything possible." The conversation around them fell silent. Joe's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then intense interest. "They want to meet? After all these years?" "Apparently so. Tomorrow afternoon, downtown." Nikki's voice remained perfectly calm. "They specified you should come alone." Miranda stepped forward. "Perhaps I should accompany you, Joe, for strategic support." "No," Nikki said quietly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "They were very specific. Alone." Joe's mind was clearly racing. "This could be huge, Nikki. They might want to discuss additional funding for the expansion. Or maybe they're ready to reveal their identity, become a full partner." "Perhaps," Nikki agreed, "though I suspect they have something quite different in mind." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at her husband. "Oh, and Joe, you might want to wear your best suit tomorrow. First impressions matter, even with old friends." As she walked away, Nikki could hear the excited chatter erupting behind her. Joe's voice rose above the others, already spinning theories about who the mysterious investor might be and what this meeting could mean for his empire. Nikki smiled to herself as she collected her coat from the check. Tomorrow, Joe would discover exactly who had been pulling the strings all along. Tomorrow, the silent queen would finally speak, and when she did, his kingdom would indeed tremble. The most dangerous woman in any room is the one everyone underestimates, and Nikki Megan Cornwell had been underestimated for far too long. Chapter 2. The Billionaires. Daughter. Blood remembers what the heart tries to forget. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Thornfield Industries penthouse as Nikki Megan stepped off the private elevator onto the executive floor. The familiar scent of fresh orchids and expensive leather filled her nostrils, triggering memories she had spent years trying to suppress. This had once been her world, a realm of unlimited power and influence that she had walked away from for love. Miss Thornfield greeted Margaret Chen, her father's personal assistant, with a knowing smile. "He's been expecting you." Nikki paused at the massive oak doors leading to her father's office. The nameplate still read Harrison Thornfield, Chairman and CEO, just as it had when she was a little girl who used to spin in his leather chair while he worked late into the evening. "Does he still keep the elephant sculpture from Kenya on his desk?" Nikki asked softly. "Right next to the photo of you graduating from Stanford," Margaret replied. "He never moved it." The doors opened to reveal Harrison Thornfield standing with his back to the entrance, gazing out at the city skyline that bore the mark of his empire. At 62, he remained an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of presence that made entire boardrooms fall silent when he entered. Buildings with his name rose like monuments across 3 states, each one a testament to the vision and determination of a man who had built everything from nothing. "Hello, Daddy." Harrison turned slowly, his dark eyes taking in his daughter's appearance with the careful assessment of a man who missed nothing. She wore a simple blue dress and modest jewelry, the uniform of someone trying to blend into the background. But he could see past the disguise to the woman underneath, his daughter, heir to an empire, trying to hide in plain sight. "My beautiful girl." His voice carried decades of love and pain. "You look tired. I've been busy." "Yes, I know. Keeping busy with charity work while your husband builds an empire on your foundation." Harrison moved to the bar cart in the corner and poured 2 glasses of his favorite bourbon. "Would you like to tell me why the most intelligent woman I've ever known is pretending to be invisible?" Nikki accepted the glass, but didn't drink. "You know why? I know what you told yourself 5 years ago. That love was more important than legacy. That marriage meant more than empire." Harrison's voice remained gentle, but steel crept into his tone. "What I want to know is whether you still believe that." The question hung between them like a challenge. Nikki walked to the window and looked down at the bustling city below. Somewhere out there, Joe was probably meeting with contractors and investors, making decisions about projects she had helped finance, taking credit for successes she had engineered. "He didn't used to be like this," she said finally. "When we first met, he was different, humble, grateful. He used to ask my opinion on everything. And now he introduces other women as the brains behind our expansion, while calling my work hobbies." Nikki's reflection stared back at her from the window, and for a moment she saw not the self-effacing wife, but the fierce woman she used to be. "Last night, a bartender told me that the most powerful person in the room is usually the one everyone's overlooking." Harrison joined his daughter at the window. "James Morrison has been working those events for 30 years. He's seen more rises and falls than anyone in this city. Smart man. You know James? I know everyone who matters, sweetheart, including your husband's new strategic consultant, Miranda Walsh." Nikki's head snapped toward her father. "What about Miranda?" Harrison's smile was sharp. "MBA from Wharton, speaks 4 languages, connections across 3 continents. Also represents the Kellerman Group, our biggest competitor. They're planning to make Joe an offer he can't refuse." The blood drained from Nikki's face. "What kind of offer?" "Buy out Cornwell Construction for significantly above market value, then dismantle it piece by piece, absorbing the profitable contracts and eliminating a growing threat to their market dominance." Harrison's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "Your husband's life's work will disappear within 18 months, and Miranda is very good at her job. Joe has no idea he's being seduced by a corporate predator." Nikki set down her bourbon with trembling hands. "You have to warn him." "Do I?" Harrison's eyebrows rose. "The same man who called you unemployed at a public gathering last night? The man who's been systematically undermining your confidence while building his success on your sacrifices? He's still my husband, and you're still my daughter." Harrison moved to his desk and pressed a button. The wall panel slid away to reveal a massive digital display showing a complex network of companies, properties, and investments. "Do you see this, Nikki? This is what you walked away from. Thornfield Industries isn't just real estate anymore. We own construction companies, architectural firms, engineering consultancies, material suppliers. We are the ecosystem that builders like Joe depend on. Nikki stared at the display, her mind racing. How long have you been watching him? Since the day you disappeared from my life to marry him. Did you think I would let my only child vanish without keeping tabs on her welfare? Harrison's voice softened. I've been protecting you both, even when you didn't want my protection. Protecting us how? Harrison pressed another button, and the display zoomed in on a specific section. Cornwell Construction's 3 biggest suppliers. Thornfield subsidiaries. His most reliable subcontractors. Companies I have strategic partnerships with. The bank that approved his major development loans. We hold 40% of their commercial real estate portfolio. The realization hit Nikki like a physical blow. You've been controlling his success. I've been ensuring it. There's a difference. Harrison turned to face his daughter fully. Your husband believes he built his empire through vision and determination. The truth is, he built it because I refused to let my daughter's husband fail. Nikki sank into one of the leather chairs, her mind reeling. Why are you telling me this now? Because tomorrow afternoon, Joe will sit in this very office and learn that his mysterious angel investor has a name, a face, and some very specific expectations about how his business should be run. Harrison poured himself another bourbon. The question is, do you want to be the woman hiding in the shadows when that happens, or do you want to be the daughter who helped orchestrate his education? What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to come home, Nikki. Not to this office, not to this building, but to yourself. The woman who graduated valedictorian from Stanford Business School. The woman who designed the expansion strategy for our Southeast operations before she was 25. The woman who could run circles around any MBA from Wharton. Harrison pulled a folder from his desk drawer and placed it in front of his daughter. Miranda Walsh thinks she's playing chess with a small-town contractor. She has no idea she's about to face the Thornfield Empire. Nikki opened the folder to find detailed dossiers on Miranda, the Kellerman Group, and their acquisition strategy. Every move they planned was documented, every weakness exposed. You knew about their plan all along. I've known about their plan since before they formed it. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Nikki studied the documents, her business mind automatically analyzing the information and formulating responses. For the first time in years, she felt the familiar thrill of strategic thinking, of seeing 10 moves ahead while others were focused on the next step. If I do this, she said slowly, if I step back into this world, there's no going back to being invisible. No, Harrison agreed. There isn't. Joe will know I've been lying to him about who I am. Yes, he will. He'll know that everything he built was built with my family's power, backing him. That too. Nikki closed the folder and looked at her father. And if he can't handle the truth? Harrison's smile was both sad and proud. Then you'll discover whether you married the man you thought you did, or the man he's become. The silence stretched between them as Nikki weighed her options. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware that in this penthouse office the balance of power was shifting. Finally, Nikki stood and walked to the family photo on her father's desk, a picture of them from her college graduation, both beaming with pride and possibility. What time is Joe's meeting tomorrow? 3 o'clock. I want to be here. Harrison's smile widened. I was hoping you'd say that, but I want to do this my way. No corporate intimidation, no hostile takeover threats. If Joe is going to learn who I really am, he's going to learn it with dignity intact. And if he chooses Miranda and the easy money over you and the hard truth. Nikki picked up the elephant sculpture from her father's desk, the same one she used to play with as a child when she dreamed of building empires, alongside the man she admired most in the world. Then he'll discover that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one you can see coming. Some daughters inherit their father's eyes, others his smile. But the rarest inherit his instinct for power and the wisdom to use it. Chapter 3. The Angel Investor Revealed. Every devil was once an angel. Every angel remembers how to fall. Joe Cornwell stood at the base of Thornfield Tower, craning his neck to take in the full height of the gleaming steel and glass monument that pierced the afternoon sky. 62 floors of pure power and influence, crowned with the golden Thornfield logo that caught the sunlight like a beacon. He had driven past this building countless times over the years, but never imagined he would be walking through its doors as anything other than a tourist. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and mahogany, with vaulted ceilings that seemed to stretch toward heaven itself. Business executives in $1,000 suits moved across the polished floors with the confident stride of people who owned pieces of the world. Joe tugged at his tie, his best one, though it suddenly felt insufficient in this temple of wealth. Mr. Cornwell, a distinguished Asian woman in an impeccable navy suit, approached him with a professional smile. "I'm Margaret Chen, Mr. Thornfield's executive assistant. He's expecting you." The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending Mount Olympus. Joe watched the floors tick by: legal department, acquisitions, international development, strategic planning. Each level representing more money and influence than he had ever dreamed of controlling. When the doors finally opened onto the executive floor, he felt like a small-town boy entering the palace of a king. "Mr. Thornfield will see you now," Margaret announced, leading him down a corridor lined with original artwork that belonged in museums. "May I offer you anything to drink? Coffee, water? Something stronger?" "Ja." "Water would be fine," Joe replied, his voice sounding smaller than he intended in the vast space. The double doors to Harrison Thornfield's office opened to reveal a room that redefined the concept of executive presence. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. Leather-bound books lined one wall, and original paintings worth more than most people's houses decorated the others. But it was the man himself who commanded attention. Harrison Thornfield stood behind his massive desk like a general surveying a battlefield. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that made senators take notes and foreign ministers return phone calls. His dark skin seemed to glow with health and vitality, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who had built an empire from nothing and defended it against all challenges. "Mr. Cornwell," Harrison said, his voice deep and resonant, "please have a seat. I've been looking forward to this meeting for a very long time." Joe settled into the leather chair across from the desk, suddenly aware of how small he felt in this monument to success. "Mr. Thornfield, I have to say, this is quite an honor. When I received the invitation to meet the angel investor who funded my first project, I never imagined that it would be me." Harrison's smile was enigmatic. "Yes, I imagine this comes as quite a surprise." "More than a surprise," Joe admitted. "Harrison Thornfield is a legend in this city. The fact that you took an interest in my little residential development project, well, it's humbling." Harrison moved around the desk and settled into the chair beside Joe, a gesture that somehow made the conversation feel both more intimate and more dangerous. "Tell me, Mr. Cornwell, what do you remember about those early days? The struggle to get financing, the rejections from traditional lenders, the moment when hope seemed lost." Joe's mind raced back to those desperate months when he had been pitching his vision to anyone who would listen. "I remember everything. 15 banks said no. 30 private investors passed. I was down to my last few $100s when your representative contacted me. And what did you think when someone you'd never met offered you exactly the amount you needed, with terms more generous than anything the banks had proposed?" "I thought I was the luckiest man alive," Joe said honestly. "I kept waiting for the catch, for the impossible conditions or the hidden clauses. But they never came." Harrison nodded slowly. "No catch, no hidden conditions. Just pure faith in your potential." But why? Joe leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his nervousness. Why me? Why that project? You could have invested in any number of established developers with proven track records. An interesting question, Harrison replied. Tell me, what do you know about calculated risks versus blind faith? Joe considered the question. In business, you try to minimize risk through research, market analysis, strategic planning. Blind faith is, well, it's usually a recipe for disaster. Usually, Harrison agreed. But sometimes, the most profitable investments are the ones that look foolish to everyone else. Sometimes you invest not in a business plan, but in a person. Sometimes you bet everything on potential rather than proven performance. And you saw that potential in me. Harrison's smile became more complex. I saw something very valuable, Mr. Cornwell, something worth protecting. Before Joe could ask what that meant, Margaret Chen entered with a crystal glass of water on a silver tray. As she set it down, Joe noticed a framed photograph on Harrison's desk, a graduation photo of a beautiful young black woman in cap and gown, beaming with pride as she stood next to a man who looked remarkably like Harrison himself. Your daughter? Joe asked, nodding toward the photo. Harrison's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Yes, my greatest achievement and my deepest heartbreak. Heartbreak. She chose love over legacy, Harrison said quietly. Walked away from everything I built to marry a man who promised her the world. I haven't seen her in years. Something about the pain in Harrison's voice made Joe uncomfortable. I'm sorry. That must be difficult. It is, especially when I watch from a distance as that man slowly destroys everything that made her special. Harrison's eyes fixed on Joe with laser intensity. Tell me, Mr. Cornwell, what would you do if someone you loved sacrificed everything for you, and you slowly began to take those sacrifices for granted? The question hit Joe like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. Nikki selling her jewelry to fund his first equipment purchases. Nikki working multiple jobs while he chased his dreams. Nikki standing in corners at industry events while he basked in the spotlight of success. I'm not sure I understand the relevance of that question to our business discussion. Harrison stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Let me tell you a story, Mr. Cornwell. 5 years ago, a young woman came to me in tears. She had fallen in love with a man who had vision but no capital, dreams but no connections, ambition but no resources. She begged me to help him, to give him the chance that no one else would give. Joe's mouth went dry. Mr. Thornfield, She was willing to use her trust fund, to liquidate her inheritance, to call in every favor I owed her from childhood. All for a man who saw only his own reflection in her eyes? Harrison turned back to face Joe. So I made a decision. I would help this man succeed, not for his sake, but for hers. I would be his angel investor, his silent partner, his invisible safety net. The room seemed to spin around Joe as the implications of Harrison's words sank in. Are you saying that someone asked you to? I'm saying that every major contract you've won in the past 5 years has come through companies I own or control. Every supplier who gave you preferential pricing has been doing business with Thornfield Industries for decades. Every bank that approved your expansion loans holds significant debt with my organization. Joe felt the blood drain from his face. That's impossible. Harrison pressed a button on his desk, and a wall panel slid away to reveal a massive digital display. Corporate connections, financial networks, and business relationships lit up like a constellation, with Cornwell Construction at the center of a web that stretched back to Thornfield Industries in dozens of different ways. Your success has been real, Mr. Cornwell. Your vision, your execution, your leadership, all of that has been authentic. But the opportunities that allowed you to demonstrate those qualities, the capital that funded your growth, the connections that opened doors, those came from someone who believed in you long before you believed in yourself. Joe stared at the display, his mind reeling. Who asked you to do this? Harrison's smile was both proud and heartbroken. The woman in that graduation photo. The daughter who loved a dreamer enough to sacrifice an empire for his happiness. I don't understand. Your daughter, she's married to someone else. She chose love over legacy, you said so yourself. Yes, Harrison agreed. She did choose love. She chose a young contractor named Joe Cornwell. The words hit Joe like a sledgehammer. His vision blurred, his chest tightened, and for a moment he thought he might faint. That's impossible. Nikki isn't. She's not. Nikki Megan Thornfield, Harrison said quietly. My only child, heir to everything you see around you. The woman you introduce as just my wife at cocktail parties. Joe's hands trembled as he reached for the water glass. Nikki never told me. She never said anything about any of this. Because she wanted you to love her for who she was, not what she owned. Because she believed that true partnership meant building something together, not inheriting something apart. Harrison's voice carried a mixture of pride and pain. Because she was naive enough to believe that love would be enough. And you let her. You let her give up all of this for me? I let her make her choice. And then I spent 5 years making sure that choice didn't destroy either of you. Harrison returned to his seat, his gaze never leaving Joe's face. But now I find myself wondering if I made a mistake. What do you mean? I mean that the man my daughter fell in love with was humble, grateful, and devoted to making her happy. The man sitting in front of me today introduces other women as the brains behind his operation while reducing his wife's accomplishments to hobbies. Joe's mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what he was learning. Miranda, the expansion strategy. You know about... I know everything, Mr. Cornwell, including the fact that Ms. Walsh represents the Kellerman Group, and that they're planning to acquire your company for the sole purpose of dismantling it. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and Joe felt the world shift beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his success, his marriage, all of it was built on a foundation he had never even seen. What happens now? He asked quietly. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That depends entirely on you, Mr. Cornwell. The question is, now that you know the truth about who your wife really is, what are you going to do about it? The most dangerous moment in any man's life is when he discovers that his greatest success was built on another's sacrifice, and his greatest failure was not recognizing it. Chapter 4. The disrespect. A woman's patience is not weakness. It's strategy. The Crystal Ballroom at the Grandview Hotel gleamed under $1,000 chandeliers as the city's elite gathered to celebrate Joe Cornwell's birthday. Golden silk draping adorned the walls. Servers in crisp white uniforms circulated with champagne and caviar, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. It was the kind of event that announced success to the world, and Joe was basking in every moment of it. Nikki stood near the bar, watching her husband hold court at the center of the room. He wore his new Italian suit like armor, his confidence radiating outward as he gestured animatedly while telling the story of his latest development project to a captivated audience of investors and politicians. She sipped her wine and marveled at how different he looked from the humble man who used to practice his presentations in their tiny apartment, asking for her feedback and genuinely caring about her opinions. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe's voice boomed across the ballroom as he tapped his champagne flute with a silver spoon. If I could have your attention for just a moment. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning toward the birthday boy. Nikki felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Joe's impromptu speeches had become increasingly unpredictable lately, especially when he'd been drinking. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate with me. Joe continued, his smile wide and practiced. 5 years ago, I was just a guy with a dream and empty pockets. Tonight, Cornwell Construction is valued at over $800 million, with projects spanning 3 states and partnerships reaching around the globe. Applause filled the room, and Joe's chest swelled with pride. Nikki noticed Miranda Walsh standing near the front of the crowd. her red dress catching the light as she gazed up at Joe with obvious admiration. "Of course, success like this doesn't happen in a vacuum," Joe went on, his tone becoming more grandiose. "It takes vision, determination, and the courage to take risks when others play it safe. But most importantly, it takes surrounding yourself with the right people." He gestured toward Miranda, who stepped forward with a demure smile. "I want to introduce you all to Miranda Walsh, our Director of Strategic Development. Miranda has an MBA from Wharton, speaks 4 languages fluently, and has connections across 3 continents. She's the brilliant mind behind our international expansion strategy." The crowd murmured appreciatively as Miranda gave a small wave. "Thank you, Joe. It's been incredible working with someone who shares my passion for global market penetration and sustainable growth strategies." "The brains behind our expansion," Joe repeated, his hand resting on Miranda's shoulder. "Without brilliant partners like Miranda, none of this would be possible." Nikki felt the familiar sting of being overlooked, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned to manage these moments, to breathe through the disappointment and maintain her composure. "Now, I know some of you have been asking about my secret to success," Joe continued, his voice taking on the tone of a motivational speaker. "And the truth is, it comes down to making smart choices, choosing the right investments, the right partnerships, the right team members." He paused dramatically. "And sometimes it means making difficult decisions about who belongs in your inner circle and who doesn't." Councilman Richard Sterling stepped forward from the crowd. "Joe, we're all curious about your personal life too. You've built this incredible empire, but you've managed to keep your private life remarkably private. Tell us about the woman behind the man." Joe's smile flickered slightly, and Nicky could see him scanning the room until his eyes found her near the bar. "Yes, well, there's not much to say, really. My wife Nicky keeps herself busy with various activities." The dismissive tone was like a slap across the face, but Nicky maintained her composure. Several people in the crowd turned to look at her with polite but disinterested smiles. "What kind of activities?" it asked Patricia Morrison, the mayor's wife. "With the kind of curiosity that wealthy women displayed toward women they considered beneath them." "Oh, charity work mostly," Joe replied with a wave of his hand. "She organizes fundraisers, volunteers at the hospital, that sort of thing. It's nice that she has hobbies to keep her occupied while I focus on building the business." Hobbies. The word hung in the air like a judgment. Nicky's charity work included running literacy programs that had taught over 3,000 adults to read, organizing housing initiatives that had provided homes for 200 veteran families, and coordinating medical missions that had performed life-saving surgeries in 4 different countries. But tonight, like every other night, it was reduced to hobbies. Miranda stepped closer to Joe, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "It's so wonderful when spouses support each other's careers. Joe, your dedication to building something truly significant is inspiring. Not everyone understands the sacrifices required to operate at this level." The implication was clear, and Nicky felt the eyes of the room briefly flicker toward her before returning to the more interesting conversation between Joe and Miranda. "Exactly," Joe agreed. "Building an empire requires focus, intelligence, and the ability to make tough decisions. You can't let sentiment cloud your business judgment or allow personal relationships to limit your potential." Nicky set down her wine glass with careful precision. Around her, the crowd was hanging on Joe's every word, but she found herself remembering a different conversation, one that had taken place the day before in her father's office. Harrison's words echoed in her mind. "The question is, do you want to be the woman hiding in the shadows when that happens? Or do you want to be the daughter who helped orchestrate his education?" "Joe, tell us about your expansion plans," called out David Chen, the city's planning commissioner. "There are rumors about international partnerships." Joe's eyes lit up. "Well, since you asked." He moved closer to Miranda, their proximity suggesting a partnership that went beyond professional collaboration. "Miranda has been instrumental in identifying opportunities in emerging markets. We're looking at projects in South America, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. It's all about finding the right local partners," Miranda added, her hand briefly touching Joe's arm. "Someone who understands both the global market and the local landscape." Joe has been incredibly open to new strategies and innovative approaches. "Unlike some people who are content with small-scale thinking," Joe said with a laugh that carried an edge of cruelty. "I've learned that you have to surround yourself with people who challenge you to think bigger, not hold you back with conventional wisdom or emotional attachments." The room erupted in knowing chuckles, and Nikki felt something inside her crystallize into cold, hard resolve. She had been patient for years, supportive through struggles, silent during celebrations. She had watched him take credit for ideas she had suggested, accept praise for successes she had funded, and build relationships with people who would have never given him a second glance without her family's invisible backing. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down to see a message from her father. "Ready to come home, daughter." Nikki looked across the room at her husband, who was now regaling the crowd with stories of his self-made success, while Miranda gazed at him with calculated admiration. She thought about the woman she used to be, valedictorian at Stanford, strategic mastermind behind Thornfield Industries' Southeast expansion, heir to a fortune that made Joe's empire look like a corner store. She typed back a single word: "Yes." "Ladies and gentlemen," came a voice from the hotel manager near the entrance. "We have a special surprise for tonight's celebration." The crowd turned toward the doorway as a team of hotel staff wheeled in an elaborate ice sculpture, a perfect replica of the Thornfield Tower, complete with the golden logo at its peak. The sculpture caught the ballroom lights and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. Joe stared at the sculpture with confusion. "I didn't order this. It's a gift," the hotel manager announced, "from Harrison Thornfield himself, with his compliments for Mr. Cornwell's continued success." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Harrison Thornfield was a legend in the city, the kind of man who didn't acknowledge the existence of small-time contractors, let alone send them birthday gifts. Joe's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something approaching panic. Harrison Thornfield. But why would he? "Perhaps he's interested in a partnership," Miranda suggested. But her voice carried a note of uncertainty. That hadn't been there before. Nikki smiled to herself as she watched the crowd buzz with speculation about Joe's mysterious connection to the most powerful man in the city. Tomorrow, all their questions would be answered. Tomorrow, the woman they had dismissed as a charity hobbyist would step out of the shadows and remind them all what real power looked like. She finished her wine and walked toward the exit, pausing only to speak quietly to the hotel manager. "Please give my compliments to my father for the lovely sculpture. Tell him I'll see him tomorrow." As she left the ballroom, Nikki could hear Joe's voice rising above the chatter, trying to deflect questions about Harrison Thornfield while maintaining his composure. But she also heard something else, a note of uncertainty, of fear, creeping into his voice for the first time in years. Tomorrow, he would learn that the most dangerous woman in any room is the one everyone underestimates. And Nikki Megan Cornwell had been underestimated for far too long. Chapter 5, The Revelation Begins. Truth is like sunrise, gradual, then blinding. The morning sun reflected off the pearl-white Bentley Continental as it glided through downtown traffic like a predator moving through still water. Nikki sat behind the wheel, her hands steady on the leather steering wheel, her mind focused on the conversation that lay ahead. She had chosen her outfit carefully. A tailored black Armani suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, Louboutin heels that added 3 inches to her already commanding height, and her grandmother's diamond earrings that caught the light like captured stars. The valet at Cornwell Construction's headquarters nearly dropped his clipboard when the Bentley pulled up to the curb. The building itself was modest. Compared to Thornfield Tower, only 12 floors of glass and steel. But it represented everything Joe believed he had built through his own vision and determination. "Good morning," Nicky said pleasantly to the young man who hurried to open her door. "I'm here to see Mr. Cornwell." The valet stared at the car, then at Nicky, clearly trying to process how someone driving a vehicle worth more than his annual salary had appeared at this middle-tier construction office. "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" "I'm family," Nicky replied with a smile that could have melted steel. "I'm sure he'll make time." The lobby of Cornwell Construction buzzed with the energy of a successful business. Employees moved purposefully across the polished concrete floors, their conversations mixing architectural jargon with financial projections. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, looked up from her computer screen as Nicky approached the front desk. "May I help you?" Sarah asked, her eyes automatically cataloguing Nicky's expensive clothing and jewelry. "I'd like to see Joe Cornwell, please." "Tell him his wife is here." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. She had been working at the company for 2 years and had only seen the boss's wife a handful of times, usually at company parties where she stood quietly in corners while Mr. Cornwell networked. The woman standing before her bore little resemblance to that forgettable figure. "Of course, Mrs. Cornwell, he's in a meeting with Ms. Walsh, but I'm sure he'll—" "Actually, don't interrupt," Nicky said smoothly. "I'll wait. But could you do me a favor and call the executive floor? Tell them Nicky Megan Thornfield is here and would like to speak with whoever's in charge of strategic partnerships." The name hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. Every person in the construction industry knew the Thornfield name. It was synonymous with power, wealth, and influence. But Mrs. Cornwell's last name was Cornwell. "I'm sorry, did you say Thornfield?" "That's correct. Nicky Megan Thornfield." Nicky handed over a business card that Sarah accepted with trembling fingers. The card was simple but elegant. Heavy stock paper with raised lettering that read, "Nicky Megan Thornfield, Chief Executive Officer, Thornfield Industries." Below that, a phone number and email address that Sarah recognized as the direct contact information for the most powerful business empire in the state. I'll call upstairs immediately," Sarah stammered, reaching for her phone. "Thank you. And Sarah, when my husband's meeting is finished, please tell him I'm here to discuss business." "He'll understand." Nicky settled into one of the leather chairs in the waiting area and observed the controlled chaos of Joe's domain. She could see his office through the glass partition, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. Inside, Joe sat at his mahogany desk while Miranda Walsh paced back and forth, pointing at documents spread across the conference table. Even from a distance, Nicky could read the tension in both their body language. "Mrs. Cornwell." Sarah's voice was higher than normal. "The executive floor would like to know if you're here in your capacity as Mrs. Cornwell or as Miss Thornfield?" "Both," Nicky replied calmly. "I found that personal and professional interests often intersect in the most interesting ways." 20 minutes later, Joe's office door opened and Miranda emerged. Her face flushed and her professional composure slightly cracked. She moved quickly toward the elevators, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Nicky noticed that she clutched her briefcase like a shield and avoided eye contact with anyone she passed. Joe appeared in his doorway, loosening his tie and running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, stressed, and older than he had the night before. When he spotted Nicky in the waiting area, his expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something approaching alarm. "Nicky, what are you doing here? And why is Sarah looking at you like I'm someone important?" Nicky rose from her chair with fluid grace. "Perhaps we should discuss this in your office." Joe's eyes took in his wife's appearance, the expensive suit, the jewelry, the way she carried herself with an authority he had never noticed before. "You look different, do I? How interesting." Nicky walked past him into his office, her heels making confident sounds against the hardwood floor. "I hope you don't mind the interruption. I know how busy you must be with all your strategic planning." Joe closed the door behind them and moved to his desk, unconsciously putting the large piece of furniture between himself and his wife. "Nicky, I know last night I may have said some things that came across as dismissive. Condescending? Publicly humiliating? Nikki settled into the chair across from his desk, crossing her legs with elegant precision. Oh, Joe, you said exactly what you meant. The question is, do you understand what you revealed about yourself in the process? I don't understand what's gotten into you today. The way you're dressed, the way you're talking. Joe's voice trailed off as he noticed the business card Sarah had left on his desk. His face went pale as he read the text. Thornfield Industries, he whispered. Nikki, where did you get this card? The same place I got this suit, these shoes, and this car, Nikki replied matter-of-factly. The same place I've been getting my identity for the past 30 years, even when I chose to hide it for the sake of someone I loved. Joe sank into his chair, the business card trembling in his hands. This is impossible. You're Nikki Cornwell. You're my wife. You work with charities and you cheat. I organize literacy programs that have taught thousands of people to read. I coordinate housing initiatives that have provided homes for hundreds of families. I run medical missions that have saved lives across 4 continents. Nikki's voice remained calm, but steel crept into her tone. And until yesterday, I was content to let you call all of that hobbies. But Thornfield Industries, that's Harrison Thornfield's company. He's one of the most powerful men in the country. Yes, he is. He's also my father. The words hung in the air like a revelation that changed the fundamental nature of reality itself. Joe stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the truth sitting across from him. Your father, he repeated slowly. Harrison Thornfield is your father. Has been since the day I was born. Lovely man, really. Very protective of his only daughter, sometimes to the point of interfering in her life choices. Nikki smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He's been particularly interested in my marriage lately. Joe's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, and his face went even paler. It's Harrison Thornfield's office. You should probably take that, Nikki suggested. I believe he has some things to discuss with you about your business relationship. With shaking hands, Joe answered the phone. This is Joe Cornwell, Mr. Cornwell. This is Margaret Chen from Mr. Thornfield's office. Mr. Thornfield would like to know if you've had a chance to consider the conversation you had yesterday afternoon. Joe's eyes fixed on Nikki, who was examining her manicured nails with apparent disinterest. Yes, I've been thinking about it. Excellent. Mr. Thornfield would like to schedule a follow-up meeting this afternoon. Would 2 o'clock be convenient? 2 o'clock, Joe repeated numbly. Perfect. Oh, and Mr. Cornwell. Mr. Thornfield mentioned that you should feel free to bring Mrs. Cornwell to this meeting. He's quite eager to see her again. The line went dead, leaving Joe staring at his phone as if it had turned into a serpent. Slowly, he looked up at Nikki, who was now watching him with the patient expression of a cat observing a cornered mouse. How long? He asked quietly. How long what? How long have you been lying to me about who you are? Nikki considered the question carefully. I prefer to think of it as allowing you to see what you wanted to see. You wanted a simple wife from a modest background who would be grateful for your success and impressed by your achievements. So that's what I became. And your father? How long has he been manipulating my business? Protecting it, actually. Every major contract, every favorable loan, every strategic partnership that has contributed to your success, all of it has been carefully orchestrated to ensure that his daughter's husband didn't fail. Nikki stood up, smoothing her skirt with practiced elegance. The question now is, what are you going to do with this information? Joe's mind raced through the implications. His success, his reputation, his entire identity as a self-made man, all of it built on a foundation he had never even seen. What do you want from me? He asked. Nikki moved to the window and looked out at the city skyline, where Thornfield Tower rose like a monument to everything she had walked away from. I want you to understand that every woman you've ever dismissed as someone's wife might be the power behind the throne. I want you to recognize that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one you're not paying attention to. She turned back to face him. And for the first time, Joe saw not his humble wife, but the heir to an empire, the daughter of a titan, the woman who had chosen love over legacy and was now questioning that choice. And most of all, Joe, I want you to decide whether you're the man I fell in love with, or the man you've become. A name has power only when spoken by the right lips. And today, Nikki Megan Thornfield had finally found her voice. Chapter 6. The Empire Unveiled. Some women inherit crowns. Others forge them in fire. The conference room on the 62nd floor of Thornfield Tower commanded a view that stretched to the horizon, where the city met the sky in a haze of ambition and possibility. Harrison Thornfield sat at the head of an obsidian conference table that reflected the afternoon sunlight like a dark mirror, while Joe Cornwell occupied the chair to his right, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his surroundings. But it was Nikki who commanded the room's attention as she stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows. Silhouetted against the cityscape like a queen surveying her domain, Joe, Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, I trust the morning has given you time to process our previous conversation. Joe's hands rested flat on the table, his knuckles white with tension. Mr. Thornfield, I have to admit that I'm still struggling to understand the full scope of what you've told me. Please, call me Harrison. We are family, after all. The words carried a subtle emphasis that made Joe flinch. Nikki, would you care to help your husband understand the extent of our involvement in his success? Nikki turned from the window, her movement fluid and confident. She wore a different outfit now, a navy blue power suit that seemed to transform her into someone Joe barely recognized. In her hands was a leather portfolio that she placed on the table with deliberate precision. Joe, do you remember Thompson Steel? She asked, her voice carrying a professional tone he had never heard before. The supplier who gave you preferential pricing on your first major project? Of course. They saved me almost 20% on materials costs. Without that deal, I never could have underbid the competition. Nikki opened the portfolio and slid a document across the table. Thompson Steel has been a Thornfield Industries subsidiary for 8 years. Here's the internal memo instructing them to provide you with cost plus 5% pricing. Joe stared at the document, his face pale. But they told me it was because they believed in my vision. They believed in my instructions, Harrison interjected smoothly. Nikki, please continue. Morrison Banking Group, Nikki said, producing another document. The bank that approved your expansion loans when 3 other institutions had turned you down. They said I was a low-risk investment. They said that because Thornfield Industries holds 42% of their commercial real estate portfolio. Here's the letter I personally wrote recommending your loan approval. Nikki's finger traced across the letterhead. Note the signature at the bottom. Joe's eyes widened as he recognized the elegant handwriting he had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards for years. You wrote this. I wrote that and 12 others like it. Every loan, every line of credit, every financial backing that allowed you to grow your business. Nikki pulled out a thick stack of papers. Would you like to see them all? This is impossible, Joe whispered. You're my wife. You don't have business connections. You don't understand finance or construction or... Joe, Harrison interrupted gently. What do you know about your wife's education? Joe looked at Nikki with growing confusion. She went to college, got a degree in Stanford University, Nikki said quietly. Bachelor's degree in economics, master's in business administration. Graduated valedictorian from both programs. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the building's air circulation system. Joe stared at his wife as if she were a stranger wearing a familiar face. You never told me that. You never asked. Nikki's voice carried no accusation, just simple fact. You were so busy telling me about your own accomplishments that you never showed any curiosity about mine. Harrison pressed a button on the table, and the wall panel slid away to reveal the massive digital display Joe had seen the day before. This time, however, the network of connections was even more complex. with Cornwall construction highlighted at the center of a web that stretched across dozens of companies and organizations. "Your cleaning service," Harrison said, pointing to one connection. "Thornfield subsidiary, your insurance company. We own 30%. The architectural firm that designed your Riverside project. They've been on our payroll for 15 years. Joe felt the room spinning around him. How is this possible? Because, my dear son-in-law, when the daughter of Harrison Thornfield falls in love with a struggling contractor, that contractor becomes part of the Thornfield family, whether he knows it or not." Harrison's smile was both kind and terrifying. "Did you think I would allow my only child to suffer through bankruptcy and failure?" But Nikki never said. She never indicated that she was capable of orchestrating a business empire. Nikki moved to the display and touched the screen, zooming in on a specific section. "Joe, what do you see here?" The display showed the southeast expansion of Thornfield Industries, a complex network of acquisitions, partnerships, and developments that had occurred over a 3-year period. At the bottom of the screen was a credit line. "Strategic plan developed by N.M. Thornfield." "You designed this?" Joe asked incredulously. "I designed the entire Southeast expansion strategy, identified target markets, analyzed competitor weaknesses, structured acquisition deals, and managed integration processes for 23 separate companies." Nikki's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "It generated $2.4 billion in revenue over 3 years. Joe's mouth opened and closed, soundlessly. The woman he had married, the woman he had dismissed as a charity volunteer with simple hobbies, had been responsible for business deals worth more than his entire company. "Show him the international portfolio," Harrison suggested. Nikki touched the screen again, and new information appeared. "Thornfield International. Operations in 17 countries. Partnerships with governments and multinational corporations. Annual revenue of $8.7 billion. She looked at Joe with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "I spent 2 years living in Singapore, setting up our Asian operations. 6 months in Dubai, establishing our Middle Eastern partnerships. I speak 4 languages fluently and have business relationships with people you read about in international news." "When?" Joe's voice was barely a whisper. "When did you do all this?" "Before I met you. Before I decided that love was more important than empire." Nikki returned to her seat, her movements controlled and precise. "I walked away from all of it to marry a man who promised me that we would build something beautiful together." Harrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "Joe, I want you to understand something very clearly. Every success you've achieved, every contract you've won, every dollar you've earned, all of it has been possible because my daughter sacrificed her birthright to make sure you didn't fail." "And what did you get in return?" Nikki asked quietly. "Last night you introduced other women as the brains behind your operation while reducing my accomplishments to hobbies. You've spent 5 years taking credit for ideas I suggested, basking in success I funded, and building relationships with people who would never have taken your phone call without my family's backing." Joe felt something breaking inside his chest, a foundation of self-worth and identity crumbling beneath the weight of truth. "I didn't know." "No," Nikki agreed. "You didn't know because you never asked. You were so invested in your image as a self-made man that you never wondered why everything always worked out so perfectly for you." Harrison stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "There's something else you should understand, Joe. The business world is not as large as you might think. People talk. Word travels quickly when someone is disrespecting the daughter of Harrison Thornfield." What do you mean?" "I mean that Miranda Walsh's employers are very interested in acquiring your company. They've been planning this move for months, using Miranda to gather intelligence and position you for a hostile takeover." Harrison's voice carried the tone of a man delivering a medical diagnosis. "The offer they're preparing will sound generous, but it's designed to strip your company for parts and eliminate you as competition." Joe's hands trembled as he processed this information. Miranda is working for my competitors. Miranda is working for people who want to destroy everything you've built. The only reason they haven't succeeded already is because my daughter has been protecting you. Harrison turned back to face the table. But protection requires cooperation, Joe, and respect requires recognition. Nikki opened another section of her portfolio and placed a single sheet of paper in front of her husband. This is a transfer agreement. It would give me controlling interest in Cornwell Construction through a series of shell companies and financial instruments. Joe stared at the document, his vision blurring. You want to take my company? I want you to understand that I already own your company. I always have. The question is whether you're going to continue pretending that you built it alone, or whether you're ready to acknowledge that the most successful partnerships are built on honesty. The room fell silent as Joe struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what he was learning. His wife, the woman he had dismissed and underestimated for years, was not only more successful than him, she was the invisible force behind everything he had achieved. What happens now? He asked finally. Harrison and Nikki exchanged a look that spoke of years of planning and patience. That depends entirely on you, Joe, Harrison said. You can continue down the path you've been on, dismissing my daughter, elevating other women, taking credit for successes you didn't earn. In which case, you'll discover very quickly what it feels like to lose everything you think you've built. Or, Joe's voice was barely audible. Nikki leaned forward, her eyes meeting his directly. Or you can remember the man I fell in love with, the one who valued partnership over ego, the one who understood that true strength comes from building others up, not tearing them down. Either way, Harrison added quietly, the age of you not knowing who your wife really is ends today. Every puppet believes it can dance, until someone shows them the strings. Chapter 7. The Downfall. Pride is gravity. The higher you climb, the harder you fall. Joe Cornwell sat in his office the next morning, staring at his phone as if it were a loaded weapon. The silence in the building was deafening. No construction crews calling in with updates, no investors scheduling meetings, no architects presenting new proposals. The usually bustling headquarters of Cornwell Construction felt like a tomb, and Joe was beginning to understand that he might be the one buried inside it. His first call had been to Miranda Walsh. It had gone straight to voicemail. His second, the call had been to Henderson Clark, the planning commissioner who had praised his vision just days earlier. Henderson's secretary had informed him that Mr. Clark was unavailable and would need to reschedule their upcoming meeting indefinitely. By the third unanswered call, Joe began to understand that something fundamental had shifted in his world overnight. His office door opened without a knock, and Miranda Walsh entered wearing a different expression than he had ever seen before. Gone was the admiring smile, the deferential tone, the careful attention to his every word. Instead, she looked at him with the cold assessment of a predator that had cornered its prey. "Good morning, Joe," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk without being invited. "I trust you had an interesting meeting yesterday afternoon." "Miranda, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you since yesterday evening. We need to discuss the Kellerman situation, and—" "There is no Kellerman situation to discuss," Miranda interrupted smoothly. "There is only a Cornwell situation, and I'm here to explain exactly what that means." Joe felt his stomach drop. "What are you talking about?" Miranda opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder, placing it on his desk with deliberate precision. "My employers have decided to accelerate their timeline. The acquisition offer for Cornwell Construction is being withdrawn." "Withdrawn?" But you said they were prepared to pay above market value for... that was when we believed we were dealing with an independent contractor who had built something worth acquiring. Miranda's voice remained professionally pleasant, but ice crept into her tone. Recent developments have made it clear that Cornwell Construction is not the self-sufficient enterprise we believed it to be. Joe's mind raced. What recent developments? Joe, did you really think you could have a meeting with Harrison Thornfield and his daughter without the entire business community finding out about it? Miranda's laugh was sharp and humorless. Word travels fast in our circles, especially when it involves the revelation that a supposedly self-made contractor has been operating as a front for Thornfield Industries this entire time. The words hit Joe like physical blows. That's not what happened. I built this company. I made the decisions. I took the risks. You took risks with Thornfield money, made decisions with Thornfield backing, and built success on a Thornfield foundation. Miranda stood and moved to the window, looking out at the modest skyline that Cornwell Construction called home. Do you know what my employers call that, Joe? They call it fraud. Fraud, that's insane. I never misrepresented. You presented yourself as an independent contractor when you were actually a subsidiary of the most powerful business empire in the state. You competed for contracts while hiding the fact that you had unlimited financial backing and political connections. Miranda turned back to face him. You took business away from legitimate competitors who were operating without the benefit of a billionaire father-in-law. Joe felt the walls of his office closing in around him. I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea about any of the Thornfield connections until yesterday. Whether you knew or not is irrelevant. What matters is that every contract you've won, every deal you've closed, every success you've achieved has been tainted by this hidden relationship. Miranda's smile was razor-sharp. My employers don't acquire tainted assets, Joe. They eliminate them. Before Joe could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and felt his blood turn to ice water. Riverside Development Corporation. Take it, Miranda suggested. I'll wait. With trembling hands, Joe answered the phone. This is Joe Cornwell. Mr. Cornwell, this is Patricia Stevens from Riverside Development. I'm calling about the Henderson residential project. Yes, Patricia. We're scheduled to break ground next month. Is there a problem with the permits? Mr. Cornwell, we've decided to terminate our contract with Cornwell Construction, effective immediately. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of Joe's office. Terminate? But we've already ordered materials, hired crews, invested months of planning. Our legal team has advised us that there may be ethical concerns regarding your company's bidding process. We're exercising the termination clause in our contract and will be seeking alternative contractors for this project. Ethical concerns? What are you talking about? We understand that you may have had access to information and resources that weren't disclosed during the bidding process. Riverside Development cannot be associated with any irregularities. The line went dead, leaving Joe staring at his phone in disbelief. Miranda watched him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a laboratory specimen. That's just the beginning, she said quietly. By noon today, you'll receive similar calls from every major client you currently have under contract. This is insane. You're destroying my company based on lies and assumptions. I'm not destroying anything, Joe. I'm simply allowing the business community to understand what you really are. Miranda moved back to her chair and sat down with elegant precision. You see, when word spread about your family connections, people began asking questions. Questions about how a small-time contractor managed to underbid established companies consistently. Questions about how you always seem to have access to the best suppliers and most favorable financing terms. Questions about whether you've been competing fairly or operating with hidden advantages. Joe's phone rang again. This time it was Morrison Construction Supply. Mr. Cornwell? This is Bill Morrison. I'm afraid we're going to have to suspend your account effective immediately. Bill, what are you talking about? We've had a relationship for 5 years. You know my credit is good. It's not about credit, Joe. It's about the fact that we've discovered you've been receiving preferential pricing through some kind of arrangement with our parent company. Our other customers are furious, and frankly, so are we. We can't continue doing business under these circumstances. Another line went dead. Another piece of Joe's empire crumbled away. How are you doing this? Joe asked Miranda, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not doing anything except allowing the truth to spread through its natural channels. The business community is remarkably efficient when it comes to sharing information about potential fraud or unfair competition. Miranda checked her watch. I'd estimate you have about 3 hours before your company is completely isolated. Joe's assistant, Sarah, appeared in his doorway looking pale and shaken. Mr. Cornwell? I have Mr. Patterson from First National Bank on line 2. He says it's urgent. Joe closed his eyes, knowing what was coming before he picked up the phone. Joe, this is Robert Patterson. I'm calling about your business lines of credit. Don't tell me. You're suspending them. I'm afraid so. The bank has become aware of some irregularities in your financial backing that weren't disclosed when we approved your loans. We need to conduct a full review of your accounts, which means freezing all business credit until further notice. Robert, this is going to destroy my company. You know I'm good for the money. You know my payment history. Joe, I'm sorry, but this decision came from the board level. There's nothing I can do. When that call ended, Joe found himself staring across his desk at Miranda Walsh with a mixture of rage and desperation. Why are you doing this to me? Because you're a fraud, Joe. Maybe an unwitting fraud, but a fraud nonetheless. Miranda gathered her papers and returned them to her briefcase. My employers don't like being deceived, and they certainly don't like competing against rigged games. What do you want? Money, a partnership. Just tell me what it will take to stop this. Miranda stood and smoothed her skirt, preparing to leave. I want you to understand something very clearly, Joe. This isn't about what I want. This is about consequences. For 5 years, you've been playing a game with dice that were loaded in your favor, and now the other players have figured it out. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. There is one thing you should know, though. None of this would have happened if you had simply treated your wife with the respect she deserved. If you had acknowledged her contributions instead of dismissing them. If you had valued partnership over ego. Nikki? What does Nikki have to do with this? Miranda's smile was both pitying and cruel. Everything, Joe. Absolutely everything. The daughter of Harrison Thornfield doesn't need to destroy you directly. She simply has to stop protecting you. As Miranda left his office, Joe slumped back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. In the space of one morning, his company had gone from successful enterprise to toxic liability. His clients were fleeing, his suppliers were abandoning him, his financing had been cut off, and his reputation was in ruins. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Divorce papers will be delivered this afternoon. Please have them signed and returned within 48 hours. Thornfield Legal Services. Joe stared at the message until the words blurred together. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, everything he thought he owned, all of it was disappearing like smoke in the wind, and the woman he had dismissed as someone with mere hobbies was the one holding the matches. When gods fall from Olympus, they remember what it means to be mortal, and mortality, it turns out, is a very uncomfortable thing. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Regret is the only currency that can't buy forgiveness. The one-bedroom apartment on Cedar Street was a far cry from the penthouse Joe had grown accustomed to over the past few years. The furniture was second-hand, the kitchen barely large enough for one person, and the view consisted of a brick wall and a dumpster. But it was what he could afford now, and in some strange way, the humility of it felt appropriate. Joe sat at the small table by the window, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements that told the story of his spectacular fall from grace. Cornwall Construction had been dissolved within 2 weeks of Miranda's revelation. The Riverside project had been transferred to a competitor. The company's assets had been liquidated to pay outstanding debts, and Joe himself had been left with exactly what he had started with 5 years earlier. Nothing but his ambition and a willingness to work. His new job was at Henderson Construction, the same company where he had worked as a junior foreman before starting his own business. The pay was modest, the work was hard, and every day he found himself taking orders from men who had once sought his advice. It was a humbling experience that grew more educational with each passing week. Joe called his supervisor, Tommy Martinez, from the construction trailer. "We need you to check the foundation measurements on the south wall." "On my way," Joe called back, setting down his coffee and reaching for his hard hat. The yellow plastic helmet was scarred and dented, a far cry from the pristine white one he had worn as company owner. But it represented something he was slowly learning to value: honest work earned through effort rather than hidden privilege. As he walked across the construction site, Joe reflected on the lessons he had been learning about himself over the past month. Without the buffer of his company's success, without the confidence that came from financial security, without the identity that came from being Joe Cornwell, construction mogul, he was discovering who he actually was underneath all the pretense. The answer was both disappointing and hopeful. During his lunch break, Joe drove to Riverside Memorial Hospital, where he had begun volunteering in the children's wing. It wasn't the kind of high-profile charity work that got mentioned at cocktail parties. It was reading books to sick kids, helping with art projects, and sometimes just sitting quietly with children who were scared and alone. Mr. Joe called out a 7-year-old named Marcus, who was recovering from surgery. "Did you bring the book about the elephant?" "I sure did, buddy," Joe replied, settling into the chair beside Marcus's bed.
"Are you ready to find out what happens to Baba?"
As he read to the children, Joe found himself thinking about Nikki's charity work, the hobbies he had dismissed so casually. He was beginning to understand that the literacy programs she ran, the housing initiatives she organized, the medical missions she coordinated, all of them required the same skills that made someone successful in business: planning, organization, leadership, problem-solving, and most importantly, the ability to see beyond your own immediate needs to help others achieve something better. After leaving the hospital, Joe made a stop that had become part of his weekly routine. The small florist shop on Main Street knew him by name now, and Mrs. Chen always had a simple bouquet of white roses ready for him. "For your mother again?" she asked kindly. "Yes, ma'am," Joe replied. Handing over the cash he had carefully budgeted from his paycheck. The drive to Sunset Memorial Cemetery took 20 minutes, and Joe used the time to prepare himself for a conversation he had been having every week since his world collapsed. His mother's grave was located in a peaceful section under an old oak tree, marked by a simple granite stone that read, "Eleanor Cornwell, beloved mother." Joe placed the fresh flowers in the vase beside the headstone and settled onto the grass beside it. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "I know it's been a week since my last visit, but I wanted to update you on how things are going." The wind rustled through the oak leaves above him, creating a gentle sound that always reminded him of his mother's voice. "I've been thinking a lot about the conversations we used to have when I was growing up. Do you remember how you always told me that character isn't what you do when people are watching, but what you do when no one's looking?" Joe pulled a few weeds away from the base of the headstone. "I'm starting to understand what you meant by that." He sat in silence for a few minutes, organizing his thoughts. "I found out something recently, Mom. Something I probably should have discovered a long time ago. But I was too proud and too focused on myself to notice. Joe's voice grew quieter. It turns out that Nicky has been taking care of you for the past 5 years. The revelation had come to him accidentally, through a conversation with the cemetery groundskeeper who had mentioned how grateful he was to Mrs. Cornwell for her generous donations to the Memorial Garden Fund. Further investigation had revealed that Nicky had been anonymously paying for his mother's grave maintenance, contributing to the cemetery's beautification projects, and even funding a scholarship program for underprivileged children in his mother's name. She never told me. Mum, not once in all these years did she mention that she was honoring your memory while I was too busy building my empire to visit your grave. Joe's voice broke slightly. She was being the daughter-in-law you deserved, while I was being the son I'm ashamed to admit I became. A young couple walked past, hand in hand, placing flowers on a nearby grave. Joe watched them and was reminded of the early days of his marriage, when he and Nicky would visit his mother's grave together and dream about the future they were going to build. I met with a lawyer this week, Joe continued. He explained the divorce papers to me. Did you know that Nicky isn't asking for anything? No alimony, no division of assets, no claims on anything we built together. He laughed bitterly. Of course, that's probably because there's nothing left to divide. And also because everything we had actually belonged to her family anyway. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. Joe knew he should be heading home soon, but these conversations with his mother had become essential to his healing process. The lawyer told me something else, though, something that I can't stop thinking about. Joe picked up a fallen leaf and turned it over in his hands. Nicky is pregnant. The words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything. Joe had learned about the pregnancy, not from his wife, but from the legal documents that mentioned provisions for child support and custody arrangements. She's carrying my child. Mom and I don't even know if she's planning to tell me about it. I've been trying to reach her for weeks, but she won't take my calls. Her father's lawyers handle all communication now. Joe's voice was filled with a pain that went deeper than the loss of his business or his reputation. I'm going to be a father, and I might never get the chance to prove that I can be the man you raised me to be. As the sun continued to set, Joe found himself making a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I'm going to keep trying. Mom, not to win her back, I'm not sure I deserve that chance, but to show her that I understand what I lost. To prove that I can be the partner she needed instead of the burden she carried. He stood up and brushed the grass off his jeans. And maybe, if I'm very lucky and work very hard, she'll give me the opportunity to be the father our child deserves. Joe placed his hand on the headstone one last time. I love you, Mom, and I promise I'll make you proud of the man I become, even if it's too late to make Nicky proud of the man I was. As he walked back to his car, Joe's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. His heart raced as he read the words, emergency. Nicky in hospital. Complications with pregnancy. Riverside General, room 314. Come immediately. Harrison Thornfield. Joe stared at the message, his hands trembling. Then he ran to his car, started the engine, and drove toward the hospital as fast as legally possible, praying to whatever gods might be listening that he wasn't about to lose the two most important people in his world. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't losing what you had, but discovering what you had only after it's gone. Chapter 9. The Test. A man's true character emerges not in success, but in surrender. The fluorescent lights of Riverside General Hospital cast harsh shadows down the sterile corridors as Joe ran toward the elevator bank, his work boots echoing against the polished floors. His construction clothes were dusty and sweat-stained from the day's labor, but he hadn't taken time to change after receiving Harrison's emergency text. The only thing that mattered was getting to room 314 as quickly as possible. The elevator seemed to move with agonizing slowness as it climbed to the third floor. Joe's mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Pregnancy complications could mean so many things, and the fact that Harrison had contacted him directly suggested that the situation was serious enough to set aside their complicated relationship. When the elevator doors finally opened, Joe nearly collided with a nurse carrying a tray of medications. "Excuse me," he said breathlessly. "I'm looking for room 314, Nikki Cornwell, or maybe Thornfield. There was an emergency." The nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, pointed down the hallway. "Third room on the right. But, sir, visiting hours are almost over, and—" "I'm her husband," Joe interrupted, then caught himself. I am. It's complicated." The nurse's expression softened with understanding. "She's been asking for someone named Joe. That's you, I take it?" Joe's heart leaped. "She asked for me?" "Ah." "For the past 2 hours. Room 314. But please check with the desk before going in. Dr. Morrison needs to speak with family members." Joe found the nurse's station and approached the woman behind the counter with barely controlled panic. "I'm Joe Cornwell. I received a message about my wife, Nikki, room 314. Mr. Cornwell, thank goodness you're here. Dr. Morrison has been waiting to speak with you. Let me page her immediately." Within minutes, a tall woman in a white coat approached the desk. Dr. Morrison looked to be in her 40s. With the calm competence of someone who had delivered both good news and bad news countless times. "Mr. Cornwell, I'm Dr. Morrison, your wife's obstetrician. We need to discuss her condition." Joe felt his knees go weak. "Is she okay? Is the baby okay?" Let's sit down," Dr. Morrison suggested, guiding him to a small consultation area. "Your wife is stable, but she's experiencing what we call pre-eclampsia. It's a serious condition that can affect both mother and baby if not managed carefully." "Preeclampsia," Joe repeated, the medical term feeling foreign on his tongue. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means her blood pressure has become dangerously elevated, and there are proteins in her urine that suggest her kidneys are being affected. If the condition worsens, it could lead to seizures, liver damage, or other complications that would threaten both her life and the baby's." Joe felt the world tilt around him. "What can you do? How do you treat it?" "Meshi, we're monitoring her closely, managing her blood pressure with medication and making sure the baby's development is progressing normally. But Mr. Cornwell, I need to be honest with you. If her condition deteriorates, we may need to deliver the baby early to save both their lives." "How early?" Joe's voice was barely a whisper. "She's at 32 weeks now. Babies born at that stage have a very good chance of survival with proper medical care. But it would mean an extended stay in the neonatal intensive care unit." Joe buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was hearing. "Can I see her?" "Of course. But Mr. Cornwell, I should warn you, she's been under significant stress, and stress can worsen preeclampsia. Try to keep the visit calm and positive." Room 314 was dimly lit, with monitors beeping softly beside a hospital bed where Nikki lay surrounded by medical equipment. She looked smaller than Joe remembered, more fragile, with an IV line running into her left arm and a blood pressure cuff that inflated automatically every few minutes. Harrison Thornfield sat in a chair beside the bed, holding his daughter's hand. When Joe entered, Harrison looked up with an expression that was equal parts relief and wariness. "Joe," Harrison said quietly. "Thank you for coming." Nikki's eyes fluttered open at the sound of voices, and when she saw Joe standing in the doorway, her face went through a complex series of emotions: surprise, pain, longing, and something that might have been hope. "Hi," she said softly, her voice hoarse from the medical stress. "Hi," Joe replied, moving slowly toward the bed as if approaching a wounded animal. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been run over by a truck." Nikki attempted a smile. "But the baby is okay. That's what matters." Joe looked at the monitor, displaying the baby's heartbeat, a steady rhythm that seemed impossibly precious and fragile. Dr. Morrison explained about the preeclampsia. What can I do? How can I help? Harrison stood up from his chair. I'm going to step out and give you two some privacy. The doctors want to keep her stress levels down, so... He fixed Joe with a meaningful look. Keep the conversation calm. After Harrison left, Joe pulled the chair closer to Nikki's bed and sat down carefully. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands rested protectively over her growing belly. I've been trying to call you, Joe said quietly. For weeks, I wanted to explain, to apologize. Joe, please, not now. I'm too tired for that conversation. Then don't talk. Just listen. Joe reached toward her hand, then stopped himself. I know I don't have the right to be here. I know I lost that right when I chose my ego over our partnership. But I need you to know that I understand now. Nikki's eyes remained closed, but Joe could see that she was listening. I found out about my mother's grave, about the scholarship fund, about all the things you've been doing that I was too self-centered to notice. Joe's voice grew thick with emotion. You've been taking care of everyone I should have been taking care of, while I was busy taking credit for everything you made possible. Your mother was a wonderful woman, Nikki said softly. She deserved to be remembered. She would have loved you, Joe replied. She would have been so proud to have you as a daughter-in-law, and she would have been ashamed of the man I became. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds coming from the medical equipment monitoring mother and baby. Finally, Nikki opened her eyes and looked directly at Joe. Why are you here, Joe? Really? Because I love you. Because I love our child. And because I want to be the man who deserves you, even if it's too late for us. It might be too late, Nikki said honestly. I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I can risk our child growing up with a father who might disappoint them the way you disappointed me. Joe felt each word like a physical blow, but he forced himself to hear them without defending himself. You're right to feel that way. I haven't earned your trust, and I haven't proven that I can be the partner you need. Then why should I give you another chance? Joe considered the question carefully. You shouldn't. Not based on promises or apologies or anything I might say right now. But maybe, if you're willing, you could let me prove it through actions. Not grand gestures or dramatic changes, but small, consistent choices that show I understand what real partnership means. Nikki studied his face for a long moment. What would that look like? I don't know yet, but I'm learning. I have a job now, a real job where I work for someone else, and take orders, and remember what it means to earn something through effort. I volunteer at the Children's Hospital, and I'm beginning to understand what you meant about the importance of helping others. I visit my mother's grave every week, and I think about the kind of man she raised me to be versus the kind of man I became. The blood pressure cuff inflated again, and both Joe and Nikki watched the numbers appear on the monitor. Joe noticed that her pressure was slightly elevated, and he made a mental note to keep his voice calm and avoid any topics that might cause her additional stress. The baby, Joe said quietly. When is it due? 8 more weeks, if everything goes normally. But with the preeclampsia, Nikki's hand moved to her belly. The doctors are hoping to keep the baby growing for as long as possible. Have you thought about names? For the first time since Joe had entered the room, Nikki's expression softened slightly. If it's a girl, I was thinking about Eleanor. After your mother. Joe felt tears spring to his eyes. She would have loved that. And if it's a boy, maybe Samuel. It was my grandfather's name. Samuel Cornwell, Joe said quietly, testing the sound of it. Or Samuel Thornfield. Nikki's expression grew guarded again. I haven't decided about the last name. The words stung, but Joe forced himself to accept them without protest. Whatever you decide, I want to be involved. I want to be the father this child deserves, even if that means proving myself over years instead of weeks. A nurse entered the room to check Nikki's vital signs, and Joe used the interruption to study his wife's face. She looked tired but strong, vulnerable but determined. She was carrying his child while managing a medical emergency, and she was doing it with the same grace and competence she had brought to everything else in her life. When the nurse left, Nikki looked at Joe with eyes that held both hope and caution. "If I were to consider giving you another chance, it wouldn't be the same marriage we had before. I can't go back to being invisible while you build your empire. I can't pretend to be less than I am so that you can feel bigger than you are." "I don't want you to be invisible," Joe said earnestly. "I want to learn how to be married to the brilliant, powerful, accomplished woman you've always been. I want to be worthy of partnership with the daughter of Harrison Thornfield, not threatened by it." Nikki closed her eyes again, and Joe could see the exhaustion weighing on her. "I need to rest now." "Of course." Joe started to stand, then paused. "Nikki, would it be okay if I came back tomorrow, just to check on you and the baby?" She was quiet for so long that Joe thought she might have fallen asleep. Finally, she spoke without opening her eyes. "Visiting hours start at 10. Love is not a feeling, it's a choice made new each day. And some choices are harder than others." Chapter 10. The Choice. Love is not a feeling. It's a choice made new each day. 3 weeks had passed since Joe's first visit to room 314, and he had kept his promise to return every day during visiting hours. Sometimes he and Nikki talked about small things: the weather, the books he was reading to the children at the hospital, the progress of his construction projects. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence while she rested, and he simply provided a reassuring presence. And sometimes, when her condition seemed stable, they talked about the future with cautious hope. Dr. Morrison had been cautiously optimistic about Nikki's progress. The medication was controlling her blood pressure, and the baby was growing steadily. But preeclampsia was an unpredictable condition, and everyone understood that the situation could change quickly. On this particular Thursday morning, Joe arrived at the hospital carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the expression of a man who had spent considerable time making a difficult decision. "Good morning," he said softly as he entered room 314. Nikki was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had in days. "Morning," she replied, noting the package in his hands. "What's that?" Joe settled into his usual chair and placed the package on the bedside table. "Something I should have given you a long time ago. But first I have something to tell you." Nikki raised an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Harrison offered me a job yesterday," Joe said quietly. "Vice President of Construction Operations for Thornfield Industries. Full salary restoration, executive benefits, and a clear path to eventual partnership in the family business." Nikki's expression didn't change, but Joe could see her processing this information carefully. "What did you tell him?" "I told him thank you, but no. Why?" Joe leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Because I need to earn my way back into your life, not be gifted a position because of who I married. Because I need to prove that I can build something real on my own before I can be trusted to help build something with you." Nikki was quiet for several moments. "That was probably the right decision." "I hope so. Your father wasn't particularly pleased, but I think he understood." Joe picked up the package and held it carefully. "This, however, is something I should have done years ago." He handed her the package, and Nikki unwrapped it slowly to reveal a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band, not the elaborate diamond ring Joe had originally proposed with, but something more meaningful. "It was my grandmother's wedding ring," Joe explained. "My mother saved it for me to give to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. I should have offered it to you when we first got married. But I was so focused on buying you the biggest diamond I could afford that I forgot about what actually mattered." Nikki held the ring up to the light, examining the simple gold band that had been worn smooth by decades of love and commitment. "It's beautiful. It represents something real, something built through years of partnership and mutual respect, something I want to earn the right to offer you again." Before Nikki could respond, an alarm began beeping from one of her monitors. Within seconds, Dr. Morrison and two nurses rushed into the room, their professional calm barely masking their urgency. "Nikki, I need you to stay calm," Dr. Morrison said, checking the monitor readouts. "Your blood pressure is spiking, and we're seeing some concerning changes in the baby's heart rate." Joe stood up quickly, moving out of the way as the medical team surrounded Nikki's bed. "What's happening?" "We need to deliver the baby now," Dr. Morrison announced, already signaling for additional equipment. "Nikki, we're going to move you to the delivery room immediately." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Joe found himself pushed into the hallway as medical personnel wheeled Nikki toward the elevator, her bed surrounded by monitors and equipment. Harrison appeared from somewhere, his face pale with worry. "What's happening?" Harrison demanded. "Emergency delivery," Joe replied, his voice tight with fear. "They said her blood pressure spiked." Father and soon-to-be ex-husband stood together in the hallway, united in their concern for the woman they both loved, waiting for news that could change everything. Dr. Morrison emerged from the delivery room an hour later, still wearing her surgical scrubs, but smiling with relief. "She's okay." "They're both okay." Joe felt his knees go weak. "The baby?" "Healthy baby girl, 5 pounds, 2 ounces. She'll need to spend some time in the NICU because she's a few weeks early, but all her vital signs are strong." Dr. Morrison's smile widened. "Would you like to meet your daughter?" The NICU was a quiet, controlled environment filled with incubators and gentle lighting. Joe followed a nurse to a small, clear box where the tiniest person he had ever seen lay sleeping peacefully. She had Nikki's delicate features and what looked like Joe's stubborn chin, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever encountered. "You can touch her," the nurse said kindly. "Babies in the NICU benefit from gentle contact with their parents." Joe reached through the access port and carefully placed his finger against his daughter's tiny hand. She stirred slightly, and her fingers wrapped around his with surprising strength. "Hello, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your daddy, and I promise I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." When he was finally able to see Nikki, she was awake but exhausted, propped up in a recovery room bed. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her blood pressure readings had stabilized. "How is she?" Nikki asked immediately. "Perfect. Absolutely perfect. She has your nose and your determination. She's already showing the nurses who's in charge." Joe sat down carefully beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Tired but better. Dr. Morrison says the preeclampsia should resolve now that she's been delivered." Nikki's eyes filled with tears. "I was so scared, Joe. For a few minutes there I thought I might not get to meet her. But you did. You're both here, you're both safe, and she's the most beautiful baby in the history of babies." Joe reached for Nikki's hand, then stopped himself. "May I?" And Nikki nodded, and Joe gently took her hand in his. "I've been thinking," Joe said quietly, "about what you said regarding earning another chance, about proving myself through actions instead of words." "Joe, I'm exhausted. Can we just let me say this one thing, and then I'll let you rest?" Joe's voice was gentle, but determined. "I don't want your money, Nikki. I don't want a position in your father's company or access to your family's connections. I don't want anything except the opportunity to earn your respect back." Nikki studied his face carefully. "What does that mean, practically speaking?" "It means I want to support our daughter through my own work, not through your family's wealth. It means I want to rebuild our relationship as equals, not as someone who owes his success to his wife's inheritance. It means I want to prove that I can be the partner you deserve, even if it takes years. And if I decide that the damage is too deep, that I can't trust you with my heart again?" Joe felt the question like a physical pain, but he forced himself to answer honestly. "Then I'll respect that decision. But I'll still want to be the best father I can be to Eleanor. I'll still want to support both of you in whatever way you'll allow." Nicky was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the city skyline, where Thornfield Tower stood like a monument to everything she had walked away from and then reclaimed. Finally, she turned back to Joe. "Do you know what the hardest part of this whole experience has been?" she asked. "Trusting me again?" "No. The hardest part has been remembering who I used to be before I learned to make myself smaller for your comfort." Nicky's voice was steady but sad. "I spent 5 years hiding my intelligence, downplaying my accomplishments, and pretending to be less than I am so that you could feel like more than you were." Joe nodded, accepting the truth of her words without defensiveness. "But watching you these past few weeks," Nicky continued, "seeing you work at a regular job, volunteer with sick children, visit your mother's grave, and refuse your father's job offer, I'm starting to see glimpses of the man I fell in love with." "Is that enough?" Joe asked quietly. "Those glimpses?" Nicky looked down at her grandmother's ring, which she still held in her free hand. "I don't know yet, but I'm willing to find out." She slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, not on her ring finger, but on her right hand, a symbol of possibility rather than commitment. "We'll take it slowly," she said, very slowly. "And if you ever make me feel invisible again, if you ever dismiss my contributions or take credit for my ideas, if you ever put your ego ahead of our partnership, you'll remind me that the most powerful woman in the city doesn't need to put up with disrespect from anyone," Joe finished. "Even her husband." "Especially her husband," Nicky corrected with the faintest hint of a smile. A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Cornwell, your daughter is awake and asking for you." "Well, not asking exactly, but she's making it very clear that she wants her mama." Nicky laughed, the first genuine laugh Joe had heard from her in months. "I suppose we should go meet our daughter properly." As they made their way to the NICU together, Joe, walking beside Nicky's wheelchair, he understood that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one written by two people who had learned the difference between love and possession, between partnership and ownership, between building something together and taking credit for someone else's foundation. Eleanor Sarah Cornwell slept peacefully in her incubator, unaware that her parents were starting over, unaware that her existence had given them a reason to become better versions of themselves, unaware that she was already the most powerful force in both their worlds. The most powerful woman in the city had one choice left: to forgive the man who forgot her worth, or teach the world that some empires are built by queens alone. In the end, she chose something more dangerous than either. She chose to build an empire together, as equals, with a man who had finally learned to see her crown.